Hey, how's it going? Well, at long last, it's time for me to get back to my kind of off and on running series, The Grand Dames of Golden Age Detective Fiction. I previously talked about Agatha Christie. Of course, I had to start with Agatha Christie. I also talked about Marjorie Allingham and Dorothy L. Sayers. There are three other Grand Dames, women writers from the Golden Age of Detective Fiction, women from the Commonwealth, I guess you could say, because all of them were pretty much British except Niall Marsh, who hails from New Zealand. But anyway, more on her in a later video. Today I want to talk about maybe the less well-known, or at least for a long time, lesser known in modern era of these six Grand Dames, and that is Gladys Mitchell. Now, Gladys Mitchell in the last couple of decades has had a bit of a career resurgence. She was quite popular in her day, but by the end of her life, her books somewhat lapsed into obscurity, and thankfully some various publishers, both online and in physical book form, have brought her back, and I have several of her books. So first, a little about Miss Gladys Mitchell. She never married. She was born in 1901 and passed away in 1983, and pretty much from when she started writing, when she published her first book, in 1929, she published a novel a year at least up until her death in 1983. So she was highly prolific. Besides her writing career, Gladys Mitchell was a teacher at various girls' schools in England for many years, decades of her life, which sometimes gave inspiration for her stories, her detective stories and other fiction. She was big into sports and games and doing various things with her students and at school and on her own. She taught English and history, and some of that history pops up in her fiction. She's most well known for creating the very interesting and unusual sleuth Dame Beatrice Adela Lestrange Bradley, better known as Mrs. Bradley. And I'm going to talk about her Mrs. Bradley mysteries today. Mrs. Bradley is a very interesting character, and Gladys Mitchell wrote 66 Mrs. Bradley mysteries, starting in 1929 with Speedy Death. Now that's one I don't happen to have a copy of, either on Kindle or in physical book form. I do have her second novel, the second in the Mrs. Bradley series, and that is The Mystery in a Butcher's Shop. Now this one... These are some of the editions that I was able to get a hold of in physical form. These are from Vintage Books, and they have very simple but kind of striking livery. These were published in Britain, and I think Vintage Books, yeah, it's just Vintage. So this was published or republished in 2010, but of course this was originally published in 1929. So she put out two Mrs. Bradley books in that year. Now, 1929 is right smack dab in the beginning point of the Golden Age detective era. You know, first, a little bit later than Miss Christie, and a little later than some of the others for the first novel. But like the others, Gladys Mitchell was a member of the Detection Club, although she often kind of liked to poke fun at the genre. And her Mrs. Bradley novels are quite unusual compared to a lot of other mysteries of the time. There are plenty of weird, twisty plots and cool locations, and of course, a very interesting and colorful main sleuth, main detective. But she is a little less concerned, Miss Mitchell is a little less concerned with the kind of minutia of an investigation, although there is definitely that. But these books are they read almost like novels in some cases, with mystery elements put in. And sometimes the mystery is sidelined for a while, and then it circles back around. Basically, people who are really into the strict puzzle plot, fair play, cluing sort of mystery don't always get on with the Mrs. Bradley mysteries, but I find them delightful and strange and interesting, and sometimes confounding, I guess, in ways too, but very, very interesting. So I own either in ebook form or physical form 22 of those 66 Mrs. Bradley mysteries. Now, Gladys Mitchell wrote 5 spy and adventure novels, historical kind of espionage and adventure novels under the name Steve Huckabee. And then throughout her career, because of course she was involved in teaching children and, girls as particularly, she wrote lots of or several juvenile kind of adventure mystery novels. But again, like I mentioned before, her main claim to fame is the Mrs. Bradley Mysteries. Mrs. Bradley is just a really fun and interesting protagonist. She's not always the main character. She's surrounded by several young people. Young people seem to really like her frank manner. So when I say young, it could be anywhere from children in their pre-teens to early teenage years, up into kind of 20s and 30-something young adults. They particularly are attracted to her because while she is not maybe physically attractive, she has something magnetic about her personality. She's frequently described as, that old pterodactyl or Mrs. Crocodile, etc. She's, a famous psychologist, psychoanalyst, or psychiatrist, and sometimes she gets involved in cases for that reason. She's described as being like yellow-clawed and having a sharp, sardonic face and bright, glittering black eyes. She's frequently described by the author, Miss Mitchell, as looking like a bird of prey. She's a small woman, gaudily dressed, but she's possessed of a beautiful, mellifluous voice that's very commanding and kind of deep. And, she is fearless. Sometimes she'll go across marshes or the moors tracking a killer. In more than one case, she single-handedly takes down or kills the murderer in the book. Sometimes she lets murderers off scot-free if she thinks the victims are, were worthy of being murdered. She's a really interesting lady, an interesting kind of, master detective or whatever. And, she cackles hideously frequently at her own sense of humor. And, is just a really fun character. She's got a vice-like grip, apparently. She's quite an interesting lady and a fun character. And she eventually, in one of my favorite books, in fact, the one that I first was exposed to this character, I used to see her in hardback novels in the library, 30 years ago or so when I was living back in the States. I'd see a bunch of her novels, and they were ubiquitous in libraries. And I picked one up called Laurels Are Poison. This kind of in the mid-pack of the years. Again, these stretch from 1929 to 1983, right? So they were, published over a 50-year period, basically, 50-plus year period. And she has distinct periods in this series. So the earlier ones are usually maybe the strongest plotted or the most unusual and strange and interesting. Some of them have some quasi-supernatural elements or possible supernatural elements maybe are there. And she has an excellent sense of place. She usually sets each mystery in a particular village or estate or location somewhere in Scotland or Ireland or wherever she ends up going. Some are set overseas. The 23rd Man is set in the Canary Islands. So, she's really good at establishing a sense of place. Come Away Death is set in Italy and Greece. So some of them are fairly globetrotting, similar to Agatha Christie. But while Agatha Christie, excellent plotter, great at dialogue, she's not, I guess it was never her real concern to spend a lot of time in description of place, because frankly, something could be taking place in, exotic European or Egyptian location in a Miss Marple or a Hercule Poirot book that Christie wrote, and you would hardly even know that you're in another country in a lot of cases. But you definitely know when you read Gladys Mitchell, you get a strong, seeping sense of the atmosphere of the location. She's great at that. She's not up to Christie levels of plotting, who is, but she does have some pretty interesting plots. Back to Laurels and Poison. In that one, Laurels and Poison, is a really fun book. I love school set mysteries. This is set in a kind of teacher's training school somewhere in England. And Mrs. Bradley there's some weird kind of poison pen and mischief going on there, which eventually leads to murder, and Miss Bradley manages to inveigle her way in as a kind of a guest teacher or substitute teacher, and of course all the young female pupils who are training to be teachers take to her right away. But she particularly bonds with three of them, and these women kind of continue off and on appearing throughout the series, particularly one named Laura Menzies. Laura Menzies is a real go-getter, kind of a jock type lady, wants to teach, PE and sports and other things. And she also has practically no fear and gets right in there and assists Mrs. Bradley in solving cases. And eventually she graduates, tries teaching for a while, doesn't really like it, and becomes Mrs. Bradley's assistant and secretary. And Mrs. Bradley doesn't really need a secretary, but she just likes having Laura around. Laura Menzies ends up marrying a Scotland Yard inspector, which turns out to be handy as things go on in the series. Anyway, I'll just talk a bit about some of the ones I have. I've read most of these that I'm going to show you, and also that I'll have up pictures on the screen of the ones I have on Kindle. I'm not going to talk about all of them because there's 66 of them. I've only read 1/3 of them, and we'd be here, for hours and hours to talk about every single one. But like I mentioned, I have the second one, The Mystery in a Butcher's Shop. This one's pretty good. It's kind of narrated by I believe he's a local, not minister, a vicar. And this is one that's known for being a kind of a parody, a little bit of a typical murder mystery at the time. It's pretty good. It's not one of my favorites in the series. Again, you have this kind of cool, simple livery. We got a little skull up there and the green border here. On the back, they show some of the other books that they put out. They were putting these out in stages. I picked a bunch of them up at that time in the kind of mid-2000 teens and early to mid-teens. But I stopped after a while because I guess I just figured I had enough for a bit. I kind of need to get back and get some more, I think. The older editions of these, the old hardback editions, because I believe this is the first paperback editions of most of these. The earlier editions are quite expensive and hard to find. There's an excellent website called The Stone House. It's a kind of Gladys Mitchell tribute site, and I will link to that in the description below. It's excellent for going through every one of the books and giving some information in a personal review by, I believe his name is Jason Hall, the guy who runs that website. Very well done place, and I learned a lot about Miss Mitchell and the Mrs. Bradley books when I was first getting into collecting her. We have the third book, The Longer Bodies. Now, I have read this one. It's very interesting. It sounds like an weird, basically some eccentric, rich woman, elderly woman, and she's not the murder victim like you might think, stages some kind of sports games on her grand estate, and the winner is perhaps going to be the first in line to inherit her wealth, and then one of the contestants ends up dead, I believe speared by a javelin. Great Aunt Puddiquet was reputed to be enormously wealthy. It was also a tradition in the family that she was extraordinarily mean. I guess mean meaning cheap, perhaps. So when the malicious old bird summons her grandnephews to perform in a great games tournament in order to secure their inheritance, they gloomily oblige. Before long, the country house games are interrupted by murder. The police are baffled, but fortunately, Mrs. Bradley, an unusual psychoanalyst with a flair for sleuthing, has begun to take a keen interest in the Puddiquet Olympics. And as you see, this one has kind of a gray color for the livery there, but it's the same vintage editions. And after that, I have the Salt Marsh Murders. So The Longer Bodies was published in 1930, and then she took, looks like a year off, I guess, or at least according to the information I have here. And then in 1932, she came out with the Salt Marsh Murders. And you'll see some in the front, sometimes they have some, little blurbs. This one, The Longer Bodies, has easily the best woman detective in fiction, News Chronicle. I think some others would beg to differ, but I think she's awfully good and awfully unique and unusual. The marvel is that though Miss Mitchell has been so prolific, she has also been so good, by Edmund Crispin's. That's a blurb from, or quote from Edmund Crispin. Edmund Crispin himself was quite an excellent mystery writer, created the character Gervase Fenn, the kind of scholar detective. One day I'll talk about him. Then we have, again, I'm not going in the order of what I have. There's several that I don't have. But I do have a lot of these early ones from the 30s because they're generally considered the strongest as far as, you know, being unique and original plots. We have Death at the Opera. This one is really good. This is one of the ones, I should say here that in 1999, the BBC did a short-run series. They started with the TV movie adaptation of Speedy Death, starring Diana Rigg. Yes, that Diana Rigg, the Mrs. Peel Avengers Diana Rigg, as Mrs. Bradley. Now, Mrs. Bradley is not described as glamorous and good-looking like even at that age Diana Rigg was. So that is not a 100% accurate portrayal. But Death at the Opera was one of the episodes. That was a short-run series. It didn't run very long. I believe 6 episodes, and then that 2-hour movie, something like that. And, you know, it's okay. It's got some good guest casts. I believe it has Alan Davies, Jonathan Creek, and it also has Peter Davison as a police inspector. And, you know, they're fun to watch, but the books are far, far better. And Mrs. Lestrange Bradley is by far the best and most vital English female detective, The Observer. Now, I don't know if that's from the time when it came out, when it was published. Death at the Opera was published originally in 1934. Pardon me as I sometimes look at my notes. Then I have, from 1935, The Death at Saxon Wall. Highly enjoyable Times Literary Supplement. Some of these I haven't read. The ones I have read, most of these first ones I've read. And some of my favorites I'll talk about, particularly like this one, Come Away Death. Come Away Death is from 1937. Miss Mitchell is certainly the most perfect and pellucid prose writer in crime fiction. Again, Edmund Crispin. And we have the little camera there. Now, Come Away Death is very interesting. It's more like a travelogue as Mrs. Bradley accompanies a group of young people and their father, I believe, and stepmother as they travel through Italy and Greece. And there's lots of strange mythic overtones. And the murder doesn't occur till nearly the end of the book. It's quite interesting. There's a certain character who goes missing and they find his head at some kind of Greek or Roman ruin, and who killed him and why, etc. Very interesting, very evocative. I highly recommend this series again. And here's a really interesting one, maybe with a more supernatural overtones. Gladys Mitchell, When Last I Died. And you'll see the nice sky blue livery there. So among the most revered names in British mystery fiction, according to the Washington Post. So I'll read you a little bit of the blurb of this one, not all of them, just a few, to give you a sense of what the plots might be like and how weird and colorful they can be. When Mrs. Bradley's grandson finds an old diary in her rented cottage, it attracts the interest of this most unconventional of detectives, for the book's now deceased owner was once suspected of the murders of both her aunt and cousin. Does the missing diary finally reveal what happened to old Aunt Flora? Is the case of Bella Foxley really closed? And what happened to the boys from the local reformatory who went missing at the same time? As events unfold, Mrs. Bradley faces one of her most difficult cases to date, one that will keep readers guessing until the very end. As you see, it's a little slimmer than some of the others. Right after that is the book I mentioned that introduces Laura Menzies in the kind of school murder mystery set in a girls' school, I shouldn't say girls' school, in a women's teaching college. And that one's great. That's Laurels Are Poison. That's was published in 1942. I have that on the Kindle version. I don't believe it was ever published by this vintage imprint, at least not that I'm aware of, in paperback form. And then some more that I have on Kindle. I have The Worsted Viper. I have read that one too, and that one was quite interesting. Kind of a conspiracy almost. Again, some of the Laura Menzies and her two close friends from that girls' school that were in Laurel's are poison are vacationing, I think, up in the Lake District. They rented a kind of canal boat, and they end up getting involved with a serial killer who stuffs a kind of worsted sewn kind of adder or viper down the mouth of his victims. It's quite interesting. And Miss Bradley eventually gets involved and solves the case. Sunset Over Soho is kind of a World War II era in London one. That was published in 1943. I also have that on Kindle. Here Comes a Chopper. I have this one back to the vintage physical book form. Fascinating Mrs. Bradley, Agatha Christie. There's a plug for you. And you'll see the bow and arrow up here. When a pair of ramblers lost in the English countryside, a man and a woman, so some romance develops, as it frequently does in these Golden Age detective novels. When a pair of ramblers lost in the English countryside stop at a country house to ask for directions, they are most astonished to be ushered in to dinner. It seems they have been invited as a necessity by a superstitious lady of the house to avoid 13 guests sitting down to dinner. But the 13th guest never arrives, and his headless body is discovered in a wood the next day. Fortunately, numbered among the original dinner guests is a rather extraordinary psychoanalyst, an amateur detective by the name of Mrs. Bradley. Then we have Death and the Maiden. Gladys Mitchell can always be relied upon for a packed and meaty novel, and an intelligent one at that, The Guardian. And here you have a little river with a little bridge over it. This one is really strange and interesting, so I got to read you the plot of this one. I've read this one, and it's got a very haunting kind of ending. When former banana grower Idris Tulson hears of a possible sightseeing of a water naiad, naiad's kind of a elemental fairy spirit, a water naiad, he insists that his wife, her Aunt Prissy, and Prissy's young ward Connie travel with him to Winchester in search of the nymph. As tensions rise between Connie and Idris, Prissy invites part-time Freudian Mrs. Bradley to join them and unofficially observe Idris and his growing obsession. Then two young boys are found drowned, and speculation mounts that the naiad is luring them to their deaths. Can Mrs. Bradley unravel the mysteries hidden within the river? So again, sometimes there's water monsters involved, ghosts, really interesting. The next one I have on Kindle that comes in, The Death and the Maiden was published in 1947. Here Comes a Chopper, 1946. And in 1948, we're in the post-World War II years now. There's The Dancing Druids, which I have on Kindle, and I haven't read that one. Then we have Tom Brown's Body. Now, I have read this one, and now we're getting in kind of the middle pack. Tom Brown's Body was published in 1949, so that's a good 20 years after the first Mrs. Bradley book, and we're over 20 entries into the series. And this is in the kind of central stage where the mysteries are good, the writing is good, but maybe not quite as wild, audacious, ambitious, and strange as the earlier ones. Tom Brown's Body is set at a boys' school, and of course, Mrs. Bradley gets herself inveigled into that school daily life and to investigate a murder of one of the instructors, what they call the schoolmasters, I believe. That one's pretty good. It's been a while since I've read it. I have another one on Kindle from 1951. Again, I'm skipping the ones in the series that I, don't have, like Groaning Spinney. Really cool, evocative titles. The Echoing Strangers. But 1950, The Devil's Elbow. I have that one. I believe The Devil's Elbow is a kind of rock formation somewhere on the coast. Don't quote me on that. I haven't read that one. And then we have Merlin's Furlong, Faintly Speaking. And then the next to last one I have physical copies of, Watson's Choice. Now this is a fun one, as Mrs. Bradley and Laura Menzies, who's now married to her chief inspector or detective inspector husband, are invited to a kind of Sherlockian get-together where a murder happens, thus Watson's Choice, right? Completely individual, instantly recognizable, and highly enjoyable. Times Literary Supplement. And we have the famous Deerstalker and Meerschaum pipe on the top. One of Sir Bohun Chantry's great passions in life is the stories of Sherlock Holmes, To celebrate the great man's anniversary, he throws a party at which the guests are instructed to come as characters from the detective stories. But several of the guests are more interested in Sir Bohun's money, and when he announces that he is to marry a poor governess, things take a turn for the worse, not least when the Hound of the Baskervilles turns up. Fortunately, Mrs. Bradley and her secretary Laura are among the guests and ready to investigate the deepening mystery. And again, as you can see, a little thinner than some of the earlier ones. Then skipping forward a little bit to 1957, this is the last one I have a paperback version of, and that is The 23rd Man. And this one's very good and highly evocatively written. I believe this is the one set in the Canary Isles. Renowned criminologist, psychoanalyst, and sardonic widow, Mrs. Bradley, is enjoying a relaxing holiday on the beautiful island of Hombres Muertos. Then a cave high up in the mountains containing the mummified bodies of 23 dead kings acquires an extra corpse overnight, and Mrs. Bradley is delighted to be called into action. As her investigations begin, it quickly becomes clear that almost everyone on the island has a motive for murder and a dark secret that they are desperate to conceal. But who is the real killer? And again, you can see, even though it's fairly thin, these are fairly lengthy. This is 223 pages of fairly small print. Bizarre, fascinating, and entertaining Tatler. Okay, well, that's the last of my physical copy books. There's several others that come after this. I have the very next book from 1958, Spotted Hemlock. I have that on my Kindle, but I haven't read it yet. I have My Bones Will Keep from 1962. I have 3 Quick and 5 Dead from 1967. Nest of Vipers from 1979. And Winking at the Brim from 1974. And the very last Mrs. Bradley novel was published in 1984 after her death posthumously, and that is The Crozier Pharaohs. Now, these later ones from the 70s and 80s are still good, still interesting, but, Miss Bradley is not quite cackling quite as much as she used to. She's not quite as strange and weird as she was in the earlier books. And so the books are a little less lively, a little less fun, but still good mysteries, good solid mysteries. And this last one I have on Kindle in ebook form, Winking at the Brim from 1974. That's one that's involving a kind of sea serpent or water monster that people are going out to look for. And that one is quite interesting as well. And finally, there was a collection of short stories put out by Lost Classics, Crippen and Landrews, Lost Classics, Sleuths Alchemy. And I have this one, and it has not only Mrs. Bradley stories, but Cases of Mrs. Bradley and Others, edited by Nicholas Fuller. Many stories featuring Mrs. Bradley and others, and they're quite short. I'd say the Mrs. Bradley stories are fine. She's much better at novel length, but these are cool, and this is a nice addition. And there's a picture, the main picture that anyone ever has or can find of Gladys Mitchell. The website, the Stone House, the Gladys Mitchell tribute site that I mentioned before, does have several very cool links on it. Links to articles about her and her interview with her, etc. Because, of course, she lived long enough to be interviewed frequently, I would think. Again, she was quite well liked and popular enough in the mystery field when she was alive. But after she died in the early 80s there, her books kind of went out of print, weren't that easy to find until these new editions were put out in the 2010s. So that's about all I have to say about Gladys Mitchell and her Mrs. Bradley series. I think that's a very unique, very fun, very interesting series. They are quite different. There's like different kind of eras within the series. And I highly recommend you check some of them out if they sound like something you might like. They're very unique. She is probably a little bit forgotten, but she is well worth seeking out, and she deserves her place, I think, among the other grand dames of detective fiction from the Golden Age era. As always, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this and found something interesting to ponder or to add to your TBR list. If you have read some Mrs. Bradley before, if you have read Gladys Mitchell before, please leave me a comment and let me know what you think of her. She is not universally liked. She might be a kind of Marmite kind of author that some people take to, like myself, and others do not. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching. Take care, and we'll see you in the next video.